Okay, so last week we kind of took the beginning tour, and now we're going to continue that tour of Buddhism. And I'm just going to do my very best because some of you in the room know more than I do. I just know this, and that's okay. And keep in mind, right, that there are many kinds of Buddhism, which is, again, why Buddhisms is really important. Most of us in America are probably most familiar with the idea of this as a philosophy that is compatible with many ways of life. And again, that's fine as long as we remember that it's not true. That's called syncretism, right? And again, that's totally fine to be syncretistic. I mean, you don't need my permission or anything, but again, it doesn't make sense to people who are practitioners because we just don't share the same underpinnings of how this is all going. Okay, I don't know why this is not doing good. People love to think that because I look young, I must know how to use technology. So that's a dangerous mistake. All right. So last week we made it here to talk about what you are. And again, you're kind of a bundle of perceptions, right? But you don't have an immortal soul. In fact, that's the problem in Buddhism, is that you think you do. Because that leads you to attachments and legacies, and that's illusion, right? That's what they suggest. So this is interesting to hear. Just going to share with you a book I recently read. Darlene, did you read this book, How Emotions Are Made? What'd you think? It's called The Constructivist View of Emotions. It's interesting that a lot of psychologists have talked about how emotions live in your limbic system, your reptilian brain, and they're sort of hardwired reactions to things. Although this book says that's patently false, and we've known that for 100 years. Darwin knew that and then went against his own research because it was too controversial. So it sort of talks about how emotions, as we understand it, are actually just our body's predictions based on our body energy budget to a situation. Now, that's really weird, but apparently that's the theory. So emotions, as we understand it, are not some kind of reptilian instinct. They're not hardwired. They're actually very conditioned, and our body has an energy budget at all times. It's trying to figure out how much energy do I need for activity Q. And essentially, emotions are our body budget response to certain stimuli that are just predictions. And loosely put, that makes some sense because anger is really just a reaction to things not going the way I thought they'd go, with energy behind it. Sadness is a reaction to things not going the way I wanted to without energy. But they essentially come from the same prediction. The question is whether I put energy behind it or not. And the reason I share that is not to tell you about this book I read, because that's actually rather Buddhist. That all of this stuff is constructed based on perception, and reality, as we normally refine it, isn't quite as real as we think it is. I know that's weird, but most Christian Buddhists don't believe that at all, which is why in some ways it's a little incompatible. Because if you're Buddhist, we construct reality. It doesn't just exist. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, then you're not a Buddhist. Okay, or I didn't explain it well. So we talked about the Eightfold Path, right, which is about cultivating right perceptions and right speech and right actions. And here's the list of don'ts, right? So we really want to avoid taking life. Well, that showed up in Hinduism too. The word was ahimsa, nonviolence. That can go a lot of different ways. So it could be that you're a vegetarian. It could be, though, that you avoid, that you're a pacifist. It could also be that you avoid taking somebody's life in business, like profiting or exploiting off somebody. And also with your speech. Now, not all Buddhists are vegetarians, and not all Buddhists belong to Jains, right? We talked about the Jains with Hinduism, who only eat essentially rotting vegetables because they perceive that plants are also living beings. And so taking the life of a plant is no good. I don't know if you're aware, there's been a lot of research on this. The trees, when you cut a branch off of a tree, it screams. It just takes it 24 hours to do it. Do you know this? This is super interesting. And that every forest has a mother tree that tells all the other trees what to do when. Now, we just had a massive acorn year, right? My yard had a lot of acorns. Turns out a mother tree tells the other trees when to drop their acorns, and that often they save up for 2 or 3 years so that they have enough nutrients to put into the acorns. So sometimes we think plants are inanimate, but that's not the research. They're just slower, right? And most of us realize that plants are like inverted animals because their brain is in their roots. So it's interesting to think that even this concern for plants, which is foreign in the West, is actually starting to be scientifically a concern. So not taking life. Not taking what's not given. So again, that's a prohibition, not just against theft, but mistaken ownership. So if something isn't a gift, it's not yours. That's interesting, right? That certainly is against ideas that we're struggling with, I would say, as citizens, like entitlement, right? If it's not given, you're not entitled to it. The clouded mind, which is why Buddhists, right, are anti-alcohol, anti-drug, right? Because that clouds your perception. And that doesn't mean you can't take medication if you're having a surgery, right? But certainly, if you are not living with life on its own terms, then you cannot be following the Eightfold Path. Whether that is binge watching television or having a nightcap to take the edge off of life every night, right? Like these are things that get in the way of you interfacing with life as you ought. I don't know if that makes sense. False speech. So that's not just about lie. Oh,
it just seems interesting to me that I'm a gardener, Tim is true, and there's it's a sense of emotion. There's a sense of emotion when you're gardening, when you're planting, when you're watching it feels, so it makes sense to me that it's an experience that's, earlier you said, I think that it's an emotional experience, or anyway, I thought that was very nice.
I mean, it is an interesting bit, right? You know, I meet people all the time who tell me animals don't have souls, and I'm wondering, like, have you ever spent time with one? Animals don't go to heaven. God only cares about people. I just really question that logic, right? Like, I understand you've been told that. I understand you've been told it, but like, I don't know if you've read the book, but like, Jesus rides around on a horse in the heavenly city, right? So look, if a horse can make it, then dogs are easily in, right? I don't know if you ever dealt with horses. Okay, so I mean, it's just an interesting thing that sometimes, once again, our perception, our belief influences what we see. We usually think seeing is believing, but believing is seeing. And Buddhism would share that as well, right? Okay, false speech, like I mentioned, and sexual misconduct. What do you know? Most major world religions are against sexual misconduct. So what are you supposed to cultivate? Moral conduct, mental concentration, and the cultivation of wisdom, right? I don't think this is necessarily unique to Buddhism, although many folks have made peace with eating meat or, clouding their mind like it's okay in this instance. I'm not telling you what's right or wrong for you, but it is interesting to think about. There is a strict prohibition on taking yourself out of the fullness of your concentration. Mental concentration is interesting, right? Because this is the kind of tradition that says the highest form of human intelligence is observing without evaluating. You were late is an evaluation. I saw you come in at 9:02 is an observation. You didn't clean your room because you're lazy is an evaluation. An observation is We agreed on your room being picked up at 9 o'clock. It is now 11 and your room is still not picked up, or something like that, right? And it's interesting to think that mental concentration isn't about thinking the right thoughts. It's living in observation instead of evaluation. I don't know if that makes sense. And this is the whole point of meditation, is not necessarily that you think the right thoughts, but that you realize thoughts come and thoughts go. Oh, I'm thinking about murdering my brother. Wonder how long that's going to last, right? Instead of, I shouldn't think that thought, because that's an evaluation, right? So meditation is really just being aware without necessarily editing. I have this inclination, I wonder where it's coming from, and like pursuing layers instead of I shouldn't, I should. This is. So meditation is often really difficult because we like to think about what it means and what's happening next. But that's all it is. Oh, I have a thought.
Is that where they get the concept of mindfulness?
Yeah, mindfulness is really just paying attention to where my body is, to what's happening in my head. And as I mentioned to you last week, there's this story about what do you do with an uninvited guest, whether that's the demon of illusion or that person who showed up without an appointment. You show them hospitality and then you show them the door. Thanks for coming by. What did you have to say? Thank you. Hope you have a good rest of your day. Time to go.
One of the meditation images to do this is, you know that you have random thoughts coming, and some of them it's a cloud. You're aware of it. You don't grab onto that thought. You just
Yes, sir.
Is there a consistent Buddhist approach to reproductive health?
I don't know the answer to that. I really don't. Because in some ways, there's different levels in the Buddhist community, right? There's monks and there's nuns who tend to be celibate. So in that community, sexual misconduct would be having it at all. What happens for your average Buddhist? Well, obviously, like Buddhists marry and are given in marriage, and they procreate. But in terms of like abortion rights and women's rights, I don't know. I don't know what's consistent. That's the hard bit.
Just in terms of they have a line of where does it's such a complicated
Yeah, and my
issue, and no real consensus across.
well, and I think that's why the S at the end, the plural, is really important, because even in the Christian tradition, there's not consistency. Now, I don't know, like any Christian tradition says, abortion is what we want. Abortion is the highest good. I don't know any tradition that says that. But many traditions say, okay, we have to look at the situation holistically instead of just a pat rule. And by the way, this is really clear in Judaism. If you know the Torah, Judaism, if you attack a woman who's pregnant and the fetus dies, you have to compensate the person financially, but not a life for a life because it's not born yet. So Judaism recognizes that a forced abortion, the baby may not have come to term. We don't know that. So it's a serious offense. If you kill the mom, you're dying. It's a life for a life. If you kill only the fetus in utero, it's a financial charge. I don't know if you realize that. So, and that's in the Torah. You can read it yourself. It's in the book of Deuteronomy. So that's the Jewish teaching on abortion, because, hey, just because you're pregnant doesn't mean the baby will fully come to term. Miscarriages can happen at 9 months, right? Stillbirths can happen. So you have the potential for a human, but in Judaism, life does not begin at conception. Human life begins upon delivery. So it's interesting that fundamentalist Christians have departed from the Jewish ethic. And how long ago did they do that? 50 years. And it was a calculated ploy by, members of the Republican Party to make it a single party. But I'm not saying that they're wrong, but I am saying it was calculated, and I'm saying it's new. You just need to know that. Like Christians have not been anti-abortion forever. And Christians have not said life begins at conception until the 70s. And somehow that became the universal position, but it isn't the universal position. There's many Christians throughout the world who don't share that point of view. That's just kind of what we're being told as one of the fundamentals in the West. And so I think Buddhism has, as with all major religions, it depends what kind of Buddhist you are. Yeah.
Well, also, the countries where Hinduism and Buddhism are people don't have as much access to healthcare. So
Yeah, so you think about indigenous Buddhism.
yeah, it's probably very lucrative, I would guess.
Yeah, it's interesting because of our puritanical roots, and I'm not saying that negatively, we've got this in our DNA as a country. We're very rule-based here in the West, more so in America than even in Europe. The Puritans didn't stay, right? They were kicked out. So if you talk to an Anglican, in general, Anglicans from England are less stressed about some of the stuff that we are. Because there was there's a middle way. We tend to be like, there's a way. I'm not saying anybody's right or wrong. I just want to describe. Yeah. So that was my loose answer. Okay, let's talk about various places you can go on pilgrimage. So it is true that you can still go to the Bodh Gaya. That, remember, is the banyan tree under which Siddhartha sat until he became awake. So you can go, and there's still a banyan tree there. And there's also a stupa, which is essentially a temple. You can also go to the place where the Buddha practiced his first sermon, Sarnuth. This is where he said, I'm awake, right? And that's what Buddha means, awake instead of asleep. You can also go to Buddha's birthplace in the Lumpini Grove. Remember, he was born a Kshatriya, that's the ruler warrior caste. And so people make pilgrimage there. You can also go to Kushingara, the place where he suffered fatal food poisoning. So sort of his death place. And some different Buddhisms have other relics associated with Siddhartha. Like, I think there's a stupa in Nepal that has one of his teeth. So there's a sort of a temple building there that has a relic of the tooth. Now, if you're a Theravada Buddhist, like a philosophical Buddhist, you couldn't care less about that. If you're a Mahayana Buddhist, right, in which there are these spiritual realities like bodhisattvas and Mara, the demon of illusion, then like relics are more important to you. So not all Buddhists go on pilgrimage, but you can.
Are all these places in India?
These ones are all in India.
In
Yes.
India.
Yep.
Okay.
And really, you're thinking northeast India, like east of Benares, if you know where Varanasi is, east of Agra, where the Taj Mahal is. If you want, let me back up. I'll show you on the map because it's good to know. There we go. So
Oh, yes.
here's this little map here of India, and you see we're sort of right on the border of Nepal is the birthplace, but here's the Bodh Gaya, right? So that gives you an idea. That light pink region is where all of these are meant to be. Okay, some symbols. So as in Hinduism, you see the lotus, which, what do you know, is a beautiful flower that grows on the muck. So it's a symbol of growing out of illusion, right? Illusion being mucky, growing out of it being lovely. I mentioned to you that the Buddha looks different according to the tradition, and he often has different mudras, different hand positions. So sometimes you think, oh, look, that's an idol. It actually functions in Buddhism just like an icon does. It's a window for proper virtue, because every hand position, the sitting position of the Buddha, even the body type, is representative of a quality. So the goal is that you look just like the Buddha, not literally, but that you embody all the virtues that are symbolically represented in the Buddha statue. And as I mentioned, you'll see Buddha look really different. Like in China, he's big and fat and bald. The real Siddhartha was never big and fat. I mean, maybe before he left the palace, but unlikely. So they don't think the Buddha was fat. The fatness is a symbol of robustness, of social wealth. It's kind of like Mary wearing a blue hijab. She didn't own anything blue. We put that on there to symbolically say the mother of the Lord is clothed in royalty. But if she'd worn blue, she'd have been impersonating a member of the gentry, and she sure wasn't, right? So sometimes we forget that these are artistic depictions that are meant to guide our piety, not historical depictions. So again, and this is true whether you're a Tibetan Buddhist, a Theravada Buddhist, you're supposed to look like the Buddha in virtue. And his different hand positions, seating will guide you into what that virtue is like. You're probably familiar with the mandala. They're often made out of colored grains of sand, and they take weeks and months to make, and they're intricate and beautiful, and as soon as it's done, you sweep it into a bin and throw it away. And that's to remind you that life is impermanent. And that art isn't meant to be held on to. It's meant to be a reminder in some ways of impermanence. So we had some Tibetan Buddhists come to UHCL, and they spent a week making a mandala out of sand, and then they swept it into a bin. So there's this joy in the process, not in the outcome. And that's a reminder of making mandalas. Now look, you can probably buy a mandala and like put it on your wall. You just need to know, right, that it's the process of the mandala, not the finality, that's important. You're meant to cultivate beauty without trying to be attached to it. That's interesting. A lot of our parenting woes come from attachment, I'm realizing, right? Like we give our children roots and wings so they can fly away, right? This is like important to remember, like you're supposed to fly away.
I kind of do the same thing with the jigsaw puzzle. And afterwards too,
Yeah. This is sort of interesting to think through what we choose to be attached to. Etch-a-sketch is another one of those, or a light bright, sure, right? And then you can see these like lovely again, is this a Theravada Buddhist piece of art? It can't be, because Theravada Buddhism is about the philosophy in which there's no God or supernatural beings. This is Mahayana, and look, here is Mara, the demon of illusion, holding the wheel of samsara, of rebirth. And within the wheel are these depictions of the cycle of life, some of the teachings of the Buddha, some of the facets of the Eightfold Path. So you can find that decoratively made, like in a mandir or a stupa, sorry, a mandir is a Hindi word. And this is sort of showing you the cycle of life from beast to human to bodhisattva, but if you get it wrong, you can come back as one of these sort of demonic bits, right? So this, I believe this one's a Tibetan Buddhist. Of course, there's, oh, sorry, yes, sir.
I'm not a Buddhist, because I can't imagine like trying to go to a starry night.
No,
Yeah.
That's my favorite.
And do keep in mind, right, that they have statues of the Buddha that essentially are artful pieces, but we perceive it wrong when the art is the idol instead of as a guide. So I think this probably exists in our own tradition as well. The Puritans mistook art as an idol, and like Roman Catholics were like, that's not an idol, that's a guide. Catholics mistake icons as an idol. Orthodox people would say they're a guide. Orthodox mistake statues as idols. Catholics would say they're a guide. And this is just important to remember that, like, we have guides, but if we hold on to a guide too hard, it actually becomes a chain. C.S. Lewis writes about this. He says, God is the great iconoclast, the breaker of images. So anytime we make an image of God for our benefit, God tries to break it. Sounds a little rough.
There's a lot of art, though, that's performative transient.
Absolutely.
You know, that they do it, slept up for a little bit, and it's taken down. Or even performance art, which is just at the moment.
As an amateur hobbyist artist, I know I'm doing art wrong when I'm attached to how it looks when I'm done, because that becomes a chain instead of a recreation. When I enjoy it while I'm making it, or when I'm like sort of, it's an outlet for the soul or whatever you say, right? That's when it's the guide. And so that's as important as we create art, but as we interact with it as well, I think. Yeah, they'll die with me. It's true. I'm not preserving them. My wife's not going to skin me and put it on the wall. You can do that.
Hopefully.
People do that, but
Really?
Oh, no.
people do all kinds of things. It's a big world. Yeah, but no, she's not interested in that. So yeah, it is temporary. And actually, since you mentioned it, it's temporary in my own lifetime, because as soon as ink goes under your skin, your body starts to try to attack and destroy it, which is why they fade over time. Yeah, that used to be really yellow. Turns out yellow is a really weak pigment, and your immune system is able to break up the ink bits. Yeah.
Top right corner, Mike, what is that? Is that Buddha?
Yeah, that's a bodhisattva, or that is the original Buddha as well.
Okay.
Okay, you know, it's so varied, these sort of Buddhist holidays, but they do focus on things like, when did the Buddha attain enlightenment? So that's like a calendar day that you might observe. Or again, there's a festival of the tooth at that particular stupa I mentioned, which is like the day the Buddha died and therefore passed on into nirvana, right? So I don't necessarily want to go over these too much, other than to say there's the events from the Buddha's life that you could celebrate. He did that, but of course they're meant to be a guide for our own journey, entering into nirvana, so death isn't scary. It's the guide, right? If you get too attached and death becomes scary, well, you don't have the right mindset. All right, here are some other things that you might see in Buddhist practice. So prayer flags, particularly you'll see that in Tibet and Nepal, and I think Bhutan as well. The idea is that when the wind blows the flag, it sort of animates your prayer. So it's a way of praying without you having to be there. We had some prayer flags in a tree here. And actually, in some ways, we use candles that way. You'll see candles in the Buddhist tradition as well. The candle is like a prayer you light, and your prayer is carried up, even if you're not doing it. I don't know if that makes sense. That's part of the root of our candle altar, right? Is that I'm lighting this candle in prayer, and it's burning without me being there. Here's a stupa. A stupa is usually a place that has like a reliquary inside, right? Like I said, the stupa of the tooth. You'll see pagodas, and that's particularly, you'll see them in Japanese Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism as well. I don't know if anybody's been to Beijing. There's some really lovely pagodas outside the Forbidden City, right? Temple of Heaven is one of those. It's really pretty. Okay, the prayer wheels, Bhutan, Tibet, similar idea, right? That when you move that wheel, it's like putting your sort of your prayer in motion. Prayers are a little different though. It's not like you're going to turn a wheel and say, God, my aunt is sick, heal my aunt's sickness. The prayer is really an awareness, a proper thinking. As I mentioned to you when we talked about Christianity, it's sort of an awareness of the divine presence. Now, you don't have to believe in God to be Buddhist, so it's an awareness of the proper wisdom or the proper mentality that you're trying to cultivate, and you're sort of putting that in motion, if that makes sense. I haven't seen prayer wheels in any church I've been to. I haven't. So I think it's pretty uniquely Buddhist. Anybody seen a prayer wheel in a church that you spin? And usually they'll be in Pali, right? That's not Sanskrit, that's Pali. That's the sort of the script. Anybody seen The Golden Child, by the way, with Eddie Murphy in the 1980s? Yeah, so you'll see those two, right? I want the knife, give me the knife. Anyway, okay. All right. Yeah. Well, I mean, the geography is accurate,
Yeah.
right? Like you'll find that in a temple or in a sort of a convent or a monastery. You'll find those, right? As I mentioned, mudras are hand positions that are kind of kinesthetic ways of meditating. If you were here for the Enneagram retreat in Advent, each Enneagram type has a mudra associated that it's like a gesture you can use based on your personality type and the shadow it casts to try to like live into the light and eschew the darkness of your personality, right? So like if you're somebody who has a hard time, if you somebody who's clingy to things, your mudra might be the letting go mudra. And then, sure, there's some offerings that you'll see. And again, this is Mahayana Buddhism. This is not Theravada, right? If you're a Theravada Buddhist, you're not offering anything to anybody because there is no thing. But if you believe in things like bodhisattvas or that the Buddha has a spiritual presence and is trying to help you, you may find things like, flowers. You may find incense, that sort of bit, like you'd find, frankly, at a Hindu temple, an offering to one of the deities. I didn't put up beads, but do remember that prayer beads, essentially meditation beads, seem like they come from Hinduism, which made it into Buddhism, which then made it into Islam, and that's where the rosary came from. So those are beads, once again, about like a particular thought or mindset or mindfulness piece that you're going to repeat, rinse, wash, repeat, rinse, wash, repeat, rinse, wash, repeat through a cycle. Just like the rosary. Just like the 99 names of Allah, right? They put you on a meditative track that has markers so you kind of know where you are. Okay, what do you know? There's some divisions. I don't know why that's upside down, but I've been talking about these. So again, the narrowest form of Buddhism in the world is Theravada. That's upside down, sorry. But as I mentioned, that's the, there is no God, there's no soul, and this is really the philosophical piece. So you deny that you have a personality. You can't step in the same river once. There are some righteous kings, like maybe you've heard of Ashoka before. So there are the Theravada people. Most people in the US who say that they're Buddhist are not Theravada Buddhists. I don't know what Richard Gere is, other than a really bad actor. Sorry, I said that. I just don't think he's very good. Then there's the Mahayana. This is called the greater vehicle. And the greater vehicle is the ones that has generated some of, that's got like Mara, the demon of illusion. That's got bodhisattvas. That's got sort of the Buddhist as a spirit, the Buddha as a spiritual guide in the sky, trying to help you get through, right? So you might ask the Buddha for help. Here you might say, I'm going to contemplate what the Buddha did, and that would be my help. Does that make sense, the difference? Oh God, help me. God, help me live into my badness. And again, you have this option when you die in the Mahayana tradition. If you've made it to nirvana, are you just going to snuff out, which is like in some ways the goal, or are you willing to be reborn for the purpose of helping other people get there? That's the bodhisattva. Okay. So we're not going to do Eastern religion presentations. The Theravada Buddhists, I mean, this is like the Mahayanas explaining the Theravadas and why they're not Theravada. They want to get it all right. They want to get it all exactly right. And the Mahayana perspective, according to themselves, is look, if the house is on fire, you just need to get out as quickly as you can. You don't need to get out the right way. You just need to get out. So that's why, again, it's called the greater vehicle. That's their own description of, we're living in a burning house that is attachment, idea of permanence, and you need to get out of that however you can. And what do you know? There might be many windows and exits. As long as you get out, you're good. That's actually all I had to say about Buddhism. So I know I have not covered maybe the things you're most interested in. So what did I miss?
Yoga.
Yeah, George Lucas is I guess he's semi-Buddhist, right? I mean, although it's really a mishmash of his own like world philosophy, that whole story. And of course, you'll notice if you are familiar with the Star Wars movies, which aren't very good. Sorry, I said that. I mean, the script writing is really awful, and it's really talented taking a good actor and making him not good. At the time, they were amazing. When I was a kid, it was like, this is so good. And then I watched them again, and I'm like, boy, there's just something in that script. But you see that when like Obi-Wan Kenobi gets struck down by Darth Vader and comes back in this blue form, he's a Mahayana Buddhist. Like there he is from beyond the grave trying to guide Luke into some kind of nirvana, right? I mean, there's the Mahayana twist to it. Yeah.
I'm not quite certain if there's a Dalai Lama, and then there's somebody like him in China. Is that correct?
I think so.
And so, what Chinese government is trying to do, when the Dalai Lama passed away, then try to take this guy in China and then try to make him the Dalai Lama. I'm not quite sure I understand
It's probably more of a political problem than a religious one, right? Because what do you know? The Dalai Lama is in exile from Tibet, which he'd like to say is its own independent country, and China would not like to agree with that. And this is one of those problems in our own story. If you don't mind me saying, does anybody know who Anne Williams is? Perhaps you know who Roger Hutchison is? Founders of Rhode Island, both of them, prophetic witness, and their contribution to the United States government was the idea of separation of church and state, which we don't observe, which is where we have a lot of political problems. Christians vote like this. It is not the ideal of the Continental Congress. So we're doing that, and that's happening worldwide, right? Good Saudi Arabians are Wahhabis. That's fusion of church and state, and not even under a sheikh, under a prince, which is totally not how Islam should work. This is why we suffer. This is why we suffer. Yeah, we combine, we give ecclesial power to secular authority instead of keeping the two. You know, in Europe, and this is probably true in Sweden too, if you want to get married, you go to the courthouse and you have a civil union. You're one in the eyes of the state. You're a single tax entity. If you want a marriage right, then you go to church. You cannot do them both at once. Civil unions, marriages. That would have saved us a lot of stress when we were talking about same-sex unions. Because really a same-sex union is a civil reality, and then it's up to you whether it's a religious reality. But if we had done that, there would have been a lot of less stress.
That's true in a lot of countries.
It's true in a lot of countries. We are one of the few countries that combines them, right? Like I sign a marriage license, which is a civil reality on behalf of the state. But I can't unsign it. I can't divorce you. You go to court for that. So it is this weird holdover that weddings are a combination of political and religious authority. Just want to identify that, right?
Back to movies of the 80s and 90s. The Wheel of Life, Reincarnation, reminded me of the movie Defending Your Life. It's a very light movie. I think there's a good basis in it that kind of says that once you die, you go to a place where you kind of evaluate it, not exactly judge, but whether how much fear ruled your life. And if you rule your life too much, you got to go back to earth and do it again. If you've gotten smarter and fear doesn't rule your life as much, then you can go on to the next plane of existence.
Yeah. I mean, Groundhog Day is essentially a Hindu Buddhist movie. You're going to do it until you get it right. Yeah. And sometimes he sabotages. He's like, I know I'm going to do it wrong, and I'm going to enjoy it because I'm going to get to do it again, right? I mean, honestly, that's a Hollywood take on this, right? Because in some ways, reincarnation is not one of our core values in the West. It isn't. Just a reminder, like we talk about some things without the underpin. Karma only works with reincarnation, but we still love using that word without reincarnation, which is again, like that's called appropriation, not respect. What goes around comes around is only true when there's multiple lives. And the Proverbs are clear on this. Rich people sometimes defraud and get away with it. However, it's not in your best interest. That's what Proverbs says. But the Jewish Bible never believes in reincarnation. When you die, you go to the place of the dead. That's it. So, again, we just, you can meet Christian people who believe in reincarnation, but that's kind of hard. It's kind of hard because that's not been our Western tradition. So like, you can believe whatever you want to, but I don't know how much syncretism you can really get away with before it starts to become you and not a living tradition. Does that make sense? That's why it's sometimes really hard to talk about this, because people will say to me frequently, what does the church teach about blank? What does this church teach? Like, what do I think? What does the presiding bishop say? I mean, really, what does the church teach? Not much. Because we've decided we're united in worship, not doctrine. It's very frustrating for people who want to know what they're allowed to do. I mean, I guess you're allowed to do a lot if you're willing to suffer the consequences of it, right? So one of the things I respect about the Episcopal Church is that there is a lot of room. There's unity with room, but it can be frustrating if you've been raised in a tradition that says, here are the 10 things you got to do. And then I'm not saying that, so I must be wrong. And I probably am. But that is kind of who we are. Yeah. And there's not like in Buddhism, there's not like some cram poobah who's going to adjudicate whether your Buddhism is appropriate or not. You will follow perhaps a teacher who you think embodies right action and right mindfulness, like Thich Nhat Hanh. But Thich Nhat Hanh didn't have special religious power. He had earned his authority because people appreciated how he wrote and how he thought and how he interacted at the regular level. But it's not like somebody tapped Thich Nhat Hanh on the shoulder and made him the Pope, because that doesn't happen here, right? So again, the authority is relational authority, not positional authority. Who has the most authority? Well, like the Buddha, Siddhartha. But you can't ask him anything unless his bodhisattva comes to you in the night. Again, it gets complicated when a government says, we're a Buddhist government, and we're going to essentially operate the law on Buddhist principles. This is when we get into trouble with Islam too, when we say Islamic law in this country is done by Sharia. Who's Sharia? There's like 19 of them. That's part of the problem in the Islamic Republic of Iran. So the Ayatollah has religious and political power because the Ayatollah is the one interpreting all laws. But not all Muslims follow the same Sharia. So it's, again, that's where we get into complications. Do I think you can extrapolate lovely principles from Buddhism to inform your Christianity or your spirituality? I sure do, as long as you're honest that you're borrowing them. It's helpful to borrow. To say you're a Christian Buddhist is actually nonsensical. I mean, I guess you could be a Christian Mahayana Buddhist where Jesus is one of many bodhisattvas. But do you believe in reincarnation? See, if you don't, Christian Buddhist is a little disingenuous. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I think as long as we're clear, I respect this teaching, it's beneficial, I want to incorporate parts of it, then, you know, that's a little more helpful, I think, and a little more authentic. The Buddhists lighting themselves on fire, right, which happened in Vietnam. That was like really when that was a thing happening to protest the American invasion of Vietnam, which I'm not sure they're wrong. Like, we pretty much did invade Vietnam, right? Why did they do it? frankly, to out of protest. And in some ways, it wasn't so consequential for them because they're going to be reborn again, or they're going on to nirvana. Although they're really clear, like, this is painful and extreme. What's my reaction? Like, I'm scratching my head a little because that's not in my value system. And I also think like, wow, like you must think this is a bigger problem than I do. That's my same reaction to Vietnamese women carrying bombs and blowing themselves up, which happened, right? Same thing with pilots flying planes into the World Trade Center. You see a problem that is bigger than the one I see, because I'm not willing to lose my life for that. Which is, instead of me saying that's wrong and crazy, it gives me pause to think, wow, things must be really bad in your world that you're willing to forego the rest of your life to draw attention to a problem.
Suicide bombers.
Of any ilk,
Yeah.
Christian ones too, and that exists, right? That exists.
Father in America in the 70s. That's
Yeah. And obviously when you immolate yourself, you're not immolating somebody else. You've chosen to do that only to yourself, right? So the Buddhist immolation is like setting yourself on fire. They don't set other people on fire. They only do that to themselves, right? And he also linked up with Martin Luther King, at least in correspondence, right? And they actually considered themselves like really good friends and colleagues. And Martin Luther King's idea was the beloved community, which would be like the Buddhist word for the Sangha, the community that's sort of, you know, in faith, it sounds really weird, but sort of the community of the Buddha on earth. It's like the body of Christ on earth is the church, the body of the Buddha on earth is the Sangha. So they shared that as similar concepts. And the beloved community for Martin Luther King Jr. was resisting the Vietnam War, was integrated between black and white. Sorry, ladies, he forgot about you all. But for Thich Nhat Hanh, similar. Actually, there was more gender equity under Thich Nhat Hanh, and there was pacifism. So those are values that they share.
and they actually share the Eucharist at times together.
Thich Nhat Hanh was an interesting guy. He was not afraid to take communion. That's what Dr. King would have called it as a Baptist. Yeah, the Lord's Supper. Well, people on either side were doing that. And again, they were doing that saying, my life is inconsequential compared to the tragedy that's happening in the country. So it is worth sharing my life if it will benefit others. Now, again, we say like, that's really weird, but like we have like 4, 5, 12 centuries of Christian martyrs who were willing to die for their faith. Would I do that? I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure anybody knows until it's them. We had a huge problem where there were people who said, no, I'd rather keep my life, so I'll offer a sacrifice to the emperor, and then I'll repent. I don't know if you remember that. That's called the Donatist heresy. And people thought that's what God wanted, is them to not throw their life away. And then that created some problems.
And then back in the Bertrand Russell said they were read the dead.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Now, I will tell you, just for fun, my brother works at the Pentagon, and he was telling me that there is a new DoD study that sort of says more than 50% of Americans, if we were invaded by Russia, so you're imagining the Red Scare, would choose to flee instead of fight. And he was saying this as like a really critical thing, like that shouldn't, you know, like what's become of us. And, you know, like it is interesting to think how in some ways nationalism is sort of changing or not, but you know, you start to think like, if I die, who will take care of my kid? If I die, who will take care of my partner and kid? So like, you know, are we willing to die quickly? I think all religions actually ask that, like, what's the ultimate value of sacrifice and living? And that's sort of wrapped up in monks setting themselves on fire or me dying for my country. But I think all religions do at some point skirt around that question, because it's really a question of what is ultimate value. What's more important, my life or the life of the nation? What's more important, my particular convenience or service to the deity? And they answer that question differently. It's a real different culture. I don't know. I thought, well, like I probably wouldn't share my child with that, but not necessarily because it's wrong. It just doesn't meet our norms. Is everybody familiar with this? The Dalai Lama had this interaction with a child in which he kissed them full on the mouth, essentially, a child. And so we can say oh, that's pedophilia. I mean, I don't think it is. I don't think it is, but it's not within our culture. And that's a really great reminder is sometimes we see a thing from a different culture and it happens within some parameters of our own. We say that's wrong, that's gross, instead of, oh, they do that different. I wonder if it means there how it would typically mean here.
What was the reason for that?
It was a show of greeting and respect and love. The child was visibly uncomfortable.
Oh, okay.
The child was visibly uncomfortable, as your children would have been, right? Even if I've raised my child. If a priest wants to give you a hug, you can say no, right? Because we're aware of that. But 100 years ago in Boston, you did whatever the priest told you to do. So why do we say no means no? Because we see how it's been abused. But again, 100 years ago, you did what the clergy told you, which is how we got into such a big problem. Yeah.
And when I was in Saudi Arabia, I would see men going down the street holding hands, and it was like I hadn't seen that before.
Yeah, and they absolutely weren't gay, because if they were, they had their head cut off. And it's really interesting, if you see two men in the United States holding hands, the presumption is they're gay, because we're not okay with male intimacy, same-sex intimacy. We're okay with women holding hands. They're not necessarily lesbians, they're girlfriends. But men can't touch unless they're gay. So just consider that, right? Consider that. That's really weird. Your most intimate male friend is off limits to you physically. That's just a Western value, but it is not shared in the Arab world. Yeah, and in the Jewish world, my brother belongs to a particular synagogue where the rabbi will put his hands behind the head and the forehead to forehead, and that's the kind of intimacy we don't have here in the Christian tradition. Again, my brother's in New York, it's not a different country, but it is a different cultural value. Yeah, so do some football players when they score a touchdown, right?
Yeah.
But please don't do that if you like the sermon. A headbutt is not really a good way to show affection. Yeah, but I think it really is important that we mention it's good to pause when we see something that isn't the way we do it. It doesn't mean it's wrong necessarily. Now it could be, but it's important to know people do it differently instead of they don't do it like me, so they're wrong. Whether we're talking about Buddhism or Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, etc. So hopefully we've talked enough about some of those different traditions to give you pause when you see something that isn't what you're used to.
Whenever I'm at a Chinese restaurant and there's a suggestion box, I put free to bed.
That's interesting.
I don't think that's a proper channel.
Yeah. Other questions about Buddhism or comments? If I got something wrong, I'm really happy for you to correct me.
In Tibet, as opposed to Bhutan, we saw a lot more. Demonstrations of bowing and incense than we did in Bhutan. I don't know that perhaps it was just because we went, we were in Lhasa, and then we went to a couple of schools in Bhutan. We didn't see that as much of that.
Yeah. So I do want to raise up, there's something really important about visiting a place as opposed to reading about a concept. So, and just to share, like I can talk to you about the fundamental differences between Shiite and Sunnite Islam, but until I went to Iran, I couldn't tell you how a Shiite mosque was different from a Sunnite mosque. And I can, right? Like I mentioned to you, there's clay things you put your head on. I haven't read a book where that happens. I mean, I probably could Google that specific question, but sometimes you don't know what to ask until you see, right? And the same thing with prayer times. Like I know all Muslims pray 5 times a day, but I didn't realize till I went to Iran that if you're Shiite, 3 of them are prescribed and you do the other 2 when you want. Whereas when you're Sunnite, all 5 are prescribed. Again, these like not things you necessarily read about or know about until you see it and you say, I wonder what that is, right? So that is part of the beauty of travel, right? Is sort of seeing how people do it. And as I've mentioned, when I went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I know I already told the story, but there's this slab where the dead Jesus was laid after the crucifixion. It's in the church. And, you know, for me, it's like, that's probably not the same thing, you know, like there's no way that's the right slab. Like, how do they possibly get that right? And then there's these like Russian Orthodox Christians who are weeping and like pouring oil on this and commingling the oil with their tears. They were like anointing Jesus's, for lack of a better word, like morgue platform. And there was something really compelling about it. Like my skepticism went out the window immediately when I saw a human being in their piety. And that is like a really, I think, transfiguring part about appreciating other religions. I can be critical about political stances and this or that, but humans and their piety is pretty transcendental to me. Any other thoughts about Buddhism? Reminder, part of the bowing, and I don't know the answer to this, but part of the bowing you mentioned, right, could come from the Namaste tradition of Hinduism. Because when you believe people can be bodhisattvas, and when you believe that these bodhisattvas are spiritual beings come around to help, then you can see sacred in other people. But I would share with you a fundamental tenet, no matter what kind of Buddhist you are, is that you wish your neighbor is free from pain. So if you're ever having a hard time praying for one of your enemies, Thomas Merton suggests you start with the Buddhist prayer, may they be free from pain. So even if you hate them, hopefully you can hope that they are free from pain or suffering. Because you would like to be free from pain or suffering. I mean, so like this fundamental idea of compassion, I would like to not suffer, therefore I would like for you to not suffer, is sort of the basis of reconciliation and forgiveness in the Buddhist tradition. And you notice what that is. That's just a permutation of the golden rule. Do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. Would you want somebody to send you hate mail? So then don't do it. Would you want someone to out you on Facebook? So don't do that. Would you want someone to gossip about you? Well, then don't do that, right? I mean, like this should be our Christian practice too, right? But this is part of the fundamental bit about compassion. And maybe it's worth saying that one of the interesting things about Buddhism is not that they cultivate self-esteem, but that they cultivate self-compassion. Those are really different things. Self-esteem is I'm unique, I'm important, I always matter. Self-compassion is I'm worthy of care. We cultivated our kids to have self-esteem. We did that. But they don't necessarily have very good self-compassion. They don't talk to themselves the way they would talk to a friend. I don't talk to myself the way I would talk to a friend. Some of my biggest anxieties are esteem-based, not compassion-based. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Some of our biggest anxieties or things we dislike about life are based on our self-esteem. I'm important, I should win, instead of self-compassion. I tried, I showed up, I'm worthy of, I made a mistake and I'm still worthy of care. Graciela, there you did it, you forgot it again, you are so dumb. This is like self-talk that is esteem-based, because since you forgot, there's something wrong with you. Instead of, I'm just like everybody else, I forget things from time to time. Today was my day.
I think that also goes to personal pride.
It sure can. But the interesting thing about esteem is that it puts you in competition with other people, whereas compassion puts you in solidarity. And some of the best athletes I know really want their competitors to do their best. They really do. And they'd like to do their best. And at the end of the day, the best racer wins. Some competitors want to annihilate their opposition because I'm the best. I've lived both ways, and let me tell you, the latter is not fun. Because if you don't annihilate the competition, then you're flawed. And if you do, they're gone. And you're alone. So there is this false narrative in our society that commiserating means you can't compete. And I think it's a false narrative. And having come into racing later as an adult, like triathlons and marathons, like I was cheering my competitors on. When they passed me, I'm like, keep going, you can do it. And if I'm able to, I'd love to pass them later, but that's not going to make or break my race. My race is based on, do I think I put what I could into it? Did I enjoy the route? So I don't know that it's an either or. Maybe it's a both and. Maybe it's a both and.
I saw a of my race, drag racing down that road one early this morning.
You did not. You did not. Although I did drag race here in a running race like 2 weekends ago. And, you know, like I said, when Karen Williams, who's our person, is going to Boston, like if we pray to win, I just don't think that's a very good prayer. If we pray to enjoy ourselves, if we're grateful for the training, if we say, God, you know, like I have practiced a long time and I hope this race bears out the training I put in. God, as a teacher, I used to lead my math class in a prayer before a test. Help this test to be an accurate indication of how much we know. That really made my students not comfortable. God help us all get A's is a false prayer. If you haven't worked and you don't understand, why should you have an A? Why should you? Instead, like, God, I want it to represent what I know. I mean, that's a compassionate prayer, not a competitive prayer, not an esteem prayer, right? In the esteem world, everybody gets a trophy. Really against this, really against it as a parent, because it's like, wow, you got like 15 participation trophies. I mean, like, and so what? It means I paid for it instead of like you perform so well that people are awarding you a prize. It's okay if you don't win one. It's okay. Doesn't denigrate your self-worth. But anyway, there, more of my opinion. Isn't that great? Anything else about Buddhism? Okay, well, I think we've come to the end of the road then. I think we've come to the end of the road. We've covered the big five. I probably could talk to you briefly about Zoroastrianism or Sikhism, but to be honest, it's probably not worth your time. I'm going to need to do more study. So what we'll do is, I won't be here next week anyway. So we'll just call it quits for a bit and maybe take the summer off.
Yeah.
If there are things you're interested in doing in the coming year, I'd love to know. Don't say May because I've got a couple trips in May too, but I always want to spend the time with people who are already coming and meet their interests and needs if I can. I can always think up my own thing, which means you might be as miserable as I am. So if there is a thing that you're interested in us sharing together or facilitating, I'd be grateful.
When you're ready to fire up again, I'd be interested in the difference in Christian denominations.
Oh, yeah, that might be good.
So I could spend some more time. We did a little bit of that, helter-skelter in the Christianity study, but I probably could be more intentional about it. I will have to tell you, I'm going to have to grow up to do that because I have a lot of evaluation instead of observation. I have a lot of evaluation. Yeah, so I'll try to grow up some more and just give observations if I do that. Yeah, thank you, though. I appreciate that. And that is part of why we had on the World Religions Tour this year. It's part of why we had the Unitarian Universalists. That's why we had the Bay Area Unity Church come in and the Orthodox Church, so we could interact with a real person from that tradition and not just my academic bit on it. Yeah, I mean, really, I went to seminary. I didn't get a political science major, or I didn't go to the War College, so I don't know what I can tell you about that. That's its own complication. I'm open to email calls if you have ideas, and thanks for going through world religions with us. Again, I hope you've learned something that you can appreciate.
Have a safe trip.
Thank you.
Enjoy.